Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. Today, I'm going to continue with talking about Active Directory. And there's a lot of stuff to cover. Like I said last week, there's a whole lot of things that are participating under the Active Directory umbrella. So I figured one of the better ways, I don't know about the best, but one of the better ways is probably to just start from scratch and set up an Active Directory domain, and we can walk through the various pieces of it together in whatever way we encounter them. And we'll kind of assemble a working understanding of the things that we're looking at. So let's get started. I have created a Windows Server 2022 virtual machine. I haven't done anything else on it beyond installing Windows. I have installed the feature for Active Directory domain services, but I'll show you what I mean because I'm just going to log in and then we will take a look at this. The domain itself is not yet created. So if I sign in here and I open up Server Manager, it'll go through and do its thing, figuring out what it's got. This is just demo DC1. Currently, we're in a work group environment. There is no domain. If I were to go to add roles and features and open that up, you can see I've installed Active Directory domain services. And there's nothing else here other than what it came with. Storage services. Okay, nothing else. And you'll see that DNS is not currently here. And you don't want it to be here yet. It is, if you select Active Directory domain services, DNS server will be installed with it. Because like I said last week, Active Directory itself is just the directory, and that's based on LDAP. DNS is how everything in the domain finds the directory and finds the other services that are there. So DNS comes with Active Directory domain services. But when you first install it, you just install domain services. That's it. DNS will be configured when we go to promote this server to a domain controller, which is what I'm going to do now because there's really nothing else going on. So you can add a domain controller to an existing domain. You can add a new domain to an existing forest or add a new forest. What is this forest thing? So conceptually, Active Directory is designed so that you might have many domains that are actually under a single parent forest. And to kind of give you an idea of how this, is structured, let's say you have megacorp.com. Okay. Well, maybe you have different subsidiary businesses under megacorp.com. Maybe you have the ever-present contoso.megacorp.com. Maybe you also have the other one, wingtiptoys.megacorp.com. Each of these subsidiaries might have their own administration. They might have their own IT. They might have their own policies that affect the implementation of their server infrastructure. And if that's the case, they might need separate domains under Active Directory, but they'll all be under the forest of megacorp.com. In most small to medium business scenarios, there is only one domain. It's the root domain, and the forest is exactly the same. But this is why it's asking us about, okay, are you joining an existing domain? Are you joining an existing forest? Or are you just adding a new forest entirely? And in this case, we're just going to add a new forest because there's nothing else on this. It's a private Hyper-V network where only the virtual machines I set are going to be present, and there's no internet access. So this is just a self-contained demonstration setup. And I'm going to call this nextdoornetadmin.1 Nextdoor net admin. There we go. And what are we going to call it? Here's another thing. For the longest time, it was standard practice for network administrators to do something like .local or .internal or .lan, something like that, something that was guaranteed not to be in use in the outside world. And why was this? Well, a lot of people were like, well, if I have anything on the external domain name, I'm going to want people outside of the company to go to that. But that won't be on the inside, so I want to keep that separate. And then anybody who's trying to look up the public domain will have to go to public DNS, and then their traffic will go outside. But that only works under a very certain set of circumstances. Number one, that you're guaranteeing that you're never going to have any services internally. And number two, you're guaranteeing that you're never going to use any third-party trusted certificates on your internal infrastructure either. It used to be, even 10, 15 years ago, you could get a certificate from one of the big certificate providers with a .local domain on the certificate. Your primary domain name had to be something that could be publicly verified, but then they'd let you put a .local or whatever on the certificate. But that got phased out for security reasons because .local, .internal, whatever cannot actually be verified. So attaching a name that can't be verified to a public certificate is a major security risk for the certificate authorities. So if you use .local, you can't use any SSL certificates from outside within the domain, and that's a problem. It's also a problem if you set up some scenarios like Entra ID Sync. Entra ID, of course, being Microsoft's rebranded name for Azure Active Directory, which is Active Directory, but in Microsoft's cloud. If you ever go to sync your accounts from an on-prem domain into Office 365, say to do email, which is a common thing, Office 365 doesn't know what to do with .local addresses. And so you'll end up in a situation where you're syncing your accounts in there, but they don't match up with the accounts that Office 365 is trying to create, and it becomes a big mess. Microsoft's best practices have for the longest time to use your actual domain name on Active Directory because it simplifies a lot of this. If you have any services running internally, then you have direct control over your internal DNS. You do have to manage split view DNS. If I have internal server 1.nextdoornetadmin.ca, well, I have to have a public address for that in my public DNS, but then I need to have a private DNS entry on my internal domain server. So you have to manage both sets of those records, but then somebody internal will see that it's an internal address and they won't have to go out through the router. They won't have to do any NAT hairpinning, which is a real problem in and of itself. And you'll be able to get an SSL certificate for internal server 1.nextdoornetadmin.ca, and it will be trusted both internally and externally because it's using the same domain name. So for all of these reasons and more, it is really important to make sure that you're using the actual domain name, and that is a Microsoft best practice. Okay, moving on to the next screen, because there was a lot on that one just as it started. All right, functional level of the new forest and root domain. We can talk about these functional levels later on down the road. It's worth noting that your forest functional level can be any of these guys, And your domain functional level currently, I said this is 2022, and it is, but your domain functional level is Windows Server 2016. Why is that? We will come back to this later, but just for the sake of giving us something to look at later, I'm going to select a forest functional level of 2012 R2. And we'll look later at how an upgrade to these functional levels is accomplished and what it means to do so. So stick a pin in that and we'll come back to it later. Specify domain controller capabilities. It should be a DNS server. Technically speaking, it doesn't have to be, but as long as this is checked, and it should be for most of your domain controllers, as long as that's checked, it will install the DNS server role that we saw previously on its own. Global catalog server, this is the first one, so it has to be a global catalog. We'll cover what global catalogs do later on, but it's important to note that either you want every domain controller to be a global catalog, which has some ramifications in larger networks. In small networks, that's fine, but in large networks, it's going to be more likely to be problematic for reasons that we'll cover later. But if you're doing a split deployment where some are global catalogs and some are not, then you actually have to adjust a few other things in a manual fashion as well. So for small to medium businesses, every domain controller being a global catalog is pretty standard, and it will work that way. So feel free to do that. Read-only domain controller, this is something a little special, where you have a domain controller with internal DNS in a site that is a remote site. Maybe it doesn't have the same security, physical security, as your data center or wherever Microsoft thinks you're running your primary domain controllers. And maybe it should be read-only. That means that if that device is compromised, they can't adjust things there and have it feed back into the main domain and therefore compromise the company. But also, a read-only domain controller only caches information for accounts that it's told it can cache, which is typically anybody at that remote site. So it does not necessarily have the ability to read or to cache information for anybody else. And in fact, you can also configure it with a blacklist of accounts that it should never cache passwords for. Domain administrators, for example. So that if that domain controller in a less physically secure environment is compromised, it limits the compromise and the damage to the entire domain as a whole. But obviously you can't do your first domain controller as a read-only, or else you'd never be able to configure anything. So that can't be checked here. Directory services restore mode. Once Active Directory is installed and active on a domain controller, that's it. There are no such things as a local account on a directory controller, domain controller, with one exception. Directory services restore mode is actually the local machine administrator account. And this is never actually explicitly stated in any of the Microsoft documentation that I have found, but I have discovered through tinkering and through having to break into domain controllers on occasion for work purposes, that even though Windows says there's only one administrator account, and you can load into administrator as the domain administrator, or you can load into administrator using the DSRM password, the administrator account for the domain is saved in the domain. It is part of Active Directory itself. But in DSRM, Active Directory is not running because you're attempting to restore it. So it's the local machine administrator account that takes over at that point. And these can be different passwords. One's in Active Directory, one's in the local machine. But as long as Active Directory domain services is running on the machine, the local machine accounts are not accessible. Everything goes through Active Directory. So that's why it's asking you for this password. You can set it to the same thing as your domain admin account. It's probably not a great idea to do that. Unless you're, configuring a demo environment like I am, where it really doesn't matter because it's just a demo. So there's my DSRM password. Cool. A delegation for this DNS server cannot be created. If you're adding a new domain to an existing forest and you're setting up contoso.megacorp.com, which is also in the domain, it will try to reach out to megacorp.com, the forest that is running Active Directory, and create a DNS delegation to say, you're still handling everything for megacorp.com, but if you have anything for star.contoso.megacorp.com, send those over here, because this is a delegated portion of DNS that is in fact its own domain. Okay, but in this case, if I'm setting up something for nextdoornetadmin.ca, it would have to reach out to .ca and try to create a DNS delegation there. It's not going to be able to do that, no matter how hard it tries. So this is entirely expected. You can't find the authoritative parent zone, that's fine. We're not going to tick a box that says create DNS delegation, that's pointless. Additional options, a NetBIOS domain name. This is typically a shorter version of your domain. There is a 15-character limit on this for legacy purposes, which, as you can see, becomes nextdoornetadmin instead of admin. But this can be whatever you want. There's two forms of referencing a domain. One is with the actual DNS, nextdoornetadmin.ca, and then the other one is just this short code, which is handy sometimes for just being able to type it in quickly, but it's not guaranteed necessarily to find everything because it's not linked to DNS. So there are some instances where DNS is a better domain form to use, and there are instances where NetBIOS is just easier to type in. So something short in this case, nextdoornetadmin, ta-da. All right, moving on. What's next up here? Paths. Paths are going to be where the database for the actual domain, and in this case, it's NTDS. Remember, this started with Windows NT, even before Active Directory itself came along in Windows Server 2000. So in this case, Windows NT was Windows New Technology. So this is always going to essentially be New Technology Directory Services or Domain Services. And that's where it's going to be stored. Database, log files, same location. Sysvol, back in the earliest days of Active Directory, NT 2000 and 2003, it used a replication service called NTFRS, which was the NT File Replication Service. Starting in Windows Server 2008, it actually switched to DFSR, which is Distributed File System Replication. There's also Distributed File System Namespace, or DFSN, but that's a different thing entirely. And it's conceptually very cool, but practically I find it causes more problems than it solves. But DFSR, the replication component, is what domain controllers these days use to replicate the directory information. They use it to replicate certain files, which are, for example, the group policies or netlogon scripts, etc. Those are all replicated using DFSR. And since I'm not creating something with Windows Server 2003, we won't have to go through the migration process from NTFRS to DFSR. Although that is something that I still know how to do, practically, I don't think it's necessarily going to be of use to show to anybody these days. So we're just going to accept the default paths. And this has, okay, review all your options. Here it is. Okay, fine. And the password of the new domain administrator will be the same as the password of the local administrator of this computer. Again, it's not telling us here that DSRM is actually going to be the local machine administrator. But right now, before we're setting anything up as a domain, we only have a local machine administrator. So what's the point of this box with DSRM? Is it telling us that DSRM is going to be the same as the administrator, domain administrator? No. What happens behind the scenes when we go ahead is it will take the local machine administrator account that we have right now. It'll take that password and copy it to the new domain administrator, and then it will reset the local administrator account to have the DSRM password. And from then on, even though it's still technically the local machine admin, it's going to be only accessible in directory services restore mode. And so our local admin in a work group will be quasi-converted to a domain administrator. It'll have the same password. It'll have the same username of administrator, but it'll have a different security identifier because it's part of the domain, not a work group. And it will be controlled separately from the DSRM password going forward. So this last statement here is just informative. It's just telling you what you're using as the login for administrator right now. Keep using that after we do this process. Okay, cool, fine. Because if you put in a different DSRM password and then got told that it'll be the same as the local administrator, you could get confused otherwise. So it's just telling us that it's going to copy the current password over and then reset the local to DSRM. Okay. Clear as mud, right? But then when we go ahead, it will verify the prerequisites. It will go ahead and install Active Directory domain services. It will create, well, so first it's going to tell us that all the prerequisite checks passed successfully. Yay. It'll tell us some things about defaults for the security settings, because yes, it still has the ability to be capable with Windows NT 4.0 from 1999, which is not necessary. We already know that you can't create a DNS delegation. Fine, everything's good. Off we go. And then the server will automatically reboot as it's done, so that you have no more access to local machine accounts and you only log in to Active Directory itself from then on. So at this point, it's installing DNS server. It will set up DNS. It will set up the directory. It will install group policy management. I already installed that when I installed domain services. It was one of the things there. Creating a directory partition. This is an LDAP. You saw it very briefly. We'll see it again, but now it's doing a bunch of permissions rewriting, configuring DNS, and yeah, there's a lot of things it's doing behind the scenes, which we are going to have an opportunity to look at now. So then it'll reboot, and we'll be off to the races to explore our brand new Active Directory instance that we've created.
Hey folks, guess what? I talk too much. I only realized during editing that I recorded way too much material, so I'm gonna cut it off here for today, and you'll get to see the rest of it another week. If you have any thoughts on things that you'd like to hear me talk about, or comments on stuff that you've seen already, do feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door net admin who talks an awful lot, and I will see you next time.